For those of you online, my name's Caleb Ogle. I'm guest speaker for tonight, and you're joining us in Pecos, Texas. If you're feeling ill, we pray that you get better, and otherwise we hope to see your lovely face sometime around here so we can say howdy. Tonight we're going to continue our series on how to be pleasing to God. And this morning we saw that we're called to be meek, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and to be merciful. Now, we're going to dive into the next attributes of the Christian heart that we find in Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to be in verses 8 through 12 tonight. We're going to finish out this section of the Beatitudes. And then next time I'm with y'all, we'll continue down through and we'll see some parables he starts to tell, some stories with some very good teaching points. But tonight we're going to finish some aspects of a Christian life. And now these are still aspects of the heart, and they all play together. But these have to do a little bit more with our relationships with others. You'll see that. But again, they all tie together. And as we go throughout the sermon by Jesus, we'll start to see some of these ideas developed more in different parts. And so we'll try to bring that as we go through. But for now, Matthew 5, verses 8 through 12. And it says this: "Blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and say all kinds of evil things against you, lying on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you." Now, the first thing that Jesus mentions to us here, as he's continuing down, is be pure in heart. Now, it's an interesting phrase because we don't often think about purity of heart. It's not a common thing we use. Maybe you've heard of pure in heart in a fairy tale or a legend of old. Maybe in reference to a maiden who can ride a unicorn, or a boy who can pull a sword from a stone. Purity in heart is just a weird concept for us. Something that's not really here and now. And so I want us to get a good idea of what this means, because it's an attribute that Jesus tells us to have. Something we should possess, something we should acquire and work towards. So it's not something that you just intrinsically have. It's something you work for. It's something you can get. And it's an aspect of those who are part of the kingdom of God. It's an aspect of those who will see God, who are God's people. And this idea of purity in heart is not new. It goes back. And so we can see some of these things. In the Old Testament, you cannot be in the presence of God without clean hands and a pure heart. This is something priests had to make sure they had while serving the Lord. It was something required. David, in a couple of prayers or songs, asked God for a pure heart. One of these takes place in Psalm chapter 24, in verses 1 through 6 or so. I'll read that for us real quick. Psalm 24, starting in verse 1. "The earth is Yahweh's, with its fullness, the world and those who live in it. Because he has founded it on the seas, and he has established it on the rivers. Who may ascend the mountain of Yahweh, and who may stand in his holy place? Who is innocent? He who is innocent of hands and pure of heart, who does not lift up his soul to falseness and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessings from Yahweh and justice from God of his salvation. Such is the sort of those who seek him and those who seek your face, even Jacob." Salah. See, in David's prayer, he recognized that those who seek the face of God, those who seek God, those who receive justice from God and his salvation, they are ones who are pure in heart and clean of hands. And the idea behind this, the aspect of this, is that you don't go after evil things, you go after righteous things. Jesus brings this up a couple of times in the New Testament. With the Pharisees, he brought it up many times. How they say to be pure on the outside. They followed the law. They looked good. And he'll address this specifically later on a lot in the Sermon on the Mount. He compared them to whitewashed tombs, where they were white and pretty on the outside, but inside were full of death and decay. He compared them to cups that had been cleaned on the outside, yet on the inside were dirty. So, purity of heart has to do with what's on the inside, not necessarily what's on the outside. But what's on the inside, as we know, affects what happens on the outside. From where the heart is, there flows actions. We know from Jesus' teachings at other places that what the mouth speaks comes from the heart. The heart should be a place of purity. The heart is a place that God cares about. This whole list of things in the Beatitudes, the whole Sermon on the Mount is all about the heart affecting the actions of the believer. And so having a pure heart means pursuing God with all of it and purging anything that is corrupt and evil, every thought and every feeling. It's taking drastic measures to rid ourselves of evil, to rid ourselves of corruption and idolatry and leave only God, having something that is pure. And if I remember correctly, I don't have the word study up here, it just popped into my head. This word pure, I believe, is used in part for metals, for refining them. You'll have to fact check me on that one and kind of double check on making sure that this is the right word for that. But there is a word used to describe us in the Bible of one who is refined, where we are put through a fire and like gold, God takes away all the impurities and left with pure gold, something that is good. And that's this idea of a pure heart, is that we should have no evil left. So I'm not sure if it's the same word, but the idea still remains and is in other parts of Scripture. That's the idea here. Get rid of everything evil, every thought, every feeling, and every action. So this leads us into the next part. And Jesus is going to tell us that he wishes for us to be a peacemaker. Now, what does it mean to be a peacemaker? Well, a quick definition is quite easy if you just separate the words. A maker of peace. Someone who produces peace. But how do we do this? What does this really look like? What are some things that come about from this? First of all, in order to be a peacemaker, you have to be one who doesn't produce strife. You have to put forward love, kindness, and gentleness, not harshness and something that people butt against and fight against. It's not being the source of strife. We must seek to be the source of good things. We must seek to be the source of purity in the situation. But just because we don't start a fight doesn't mean we won't find ourselves in one. And we'll see that in just a moment. But when we find ourselves in a fight, what do? How do we make peace in this situation? There's another passage in Romans 12 that says, make peace with everyone as much as it depends on us. Now, this is hard work, but we're called to do what we can. We're not always going to be able to make peace with someone who wants to fight with us. We can choose not to fight with them. We can choose to forgive them. We can choose to seek reconciliation with them and to be at peace with them. But they may not choose to live at peace with us. We're not called to make them live at peace with us. We're called to live at peace with them and try to make this peace. And the biggest example I want to look at is God. God is a peacemaker. All throughout the Bible, from the garden until now, he has been making peace with humanity. Humanity continually tries to rebel against God. They fight against him. They're his enemies. We're told this in another place in Romans, that he died for us while we were still his enemies. God works hard to make peace with us. He sent his son to die for us so that we could be at peace with him. It was a very costly price for peace. It was a very costly price so that we could be with him and be at peace with him. And yet people still reject him. He is the ultimate peacemaker, and yet people reject him. So we can't expect to always be at peace with people because we're no better than God. There's no way we can make peace better than he can. But some things I want to draw from his example of being a peacemaker is that it is costly for us. Peace is not cheap, and cheap peace is fake peace. It's not true peace. Peace costs us things. It costs us our pride. It costs us ourselves. We must be self-sacrificial. Sometimes we must die in the name of peace. But more often than not, it requires us to go to someone and maybe apologize for something we don't think we should have to. Maybe it's trying to reconcile or giving more than what is owed to make peace once again. There's a lot of examples of this throughout Scripture, but peace is costly and it hurts. It's not easy necessarily. Jesus went through pain to have peace with us. And so in the pursuit of making peace, it's going to be rough work. And sometimes it's a long work. And sometimes we must be very, very patient in the process. If you notice God, He doesn't become unimpatient with us. He is very patient with us as He seeks to have peace with us constantly, bringing us to reconciliation with Him through His Son. And notice reconciliation. It's an important part of this process of being at peace. You have to reconcile to be at peace. Sometimes peace is hard because you have to confront somebody. Sometimes it takes a little bit of some friction and some fighting to make peace. Because when you say there is peace, but yet there's fighting that's just ignored, that's not true peace. That's a cheap peace. That's a false peace. We want a true peace, a costly peace. And it's hard. It's really hard. And if you find that you're at peace and it's easy, it's probably because you're not at peace. No, that's not always the case. Sometimes it comes naturally between people. But there's people in your lives that you're enemies with, that you're not at peace with. Or is that an enemy with you? You don't necessarily have to be an enemy of them. But if they're an enemy of you, you're still called to make peace with them. Just as God made peace with us. And that's something even harder to do. And love of enemies and peace with enemies is something that is very contrary to our nature, to our society, to the world. We're told if we have an enemy, take them out, beat them up, put them in prison, whatever it may be. But we're not called to love and make peace with them. That's Jesus' call. And it's interesting, later on in his sermon, he will call us to be more righteous than the Pharisees. And that's a very tall order, because they were people who devoted their entire lives to being righteous, and yet they fell short. This is an aspect that they often fell short on. They didn't make peace with each other or with other people. In fact, they caused strife. They were the source of it. So we are called to be different. We are called to be peacemakers, just like God, and follow His example. And it's not an easy one. It is a hard cost. The next point flows so beautifully, but also quite oddly, from this discussion of peace. Jesus moves on from being a peacemaker to, you're going to be persecuted. First he says, those who are persecuted will inherit the kingdom of God. And next he will say to us, you will be insulted and persecuted, and all manner of evil things will be said against you. And all of this will be on account of me, on righteousness' sake. And this is just as the prophets before you. And so we go from being a peacemaker to knowing that there's people who will not be at peace with us because they're going to injure us. They're going to attack us. They're not going to like us because they don't like Jesus and they don't like righteousness. Two important things that we're called to be. An interesting thing is a lot of people as I've studied these things and discussed them and gone through different things, is a good way to tell if you're being a Christian well in the world is, do you have some enemies who hate you because you love Jesus? That's a good way to tell how well your walk with Him is going. Is, do they see Him well enough that they hate you for Him? Or do they love you for Him? And so through this, it gives us a beautiful picture. One that is make peace with everyone, but no, you will be persecuted. It's not an if, but a when. When will this happen? We can expect to be attacked and insulted and persecuted on account of Him. But the weird part of this is there's another part in between. You're going to have all these evil things said against you on account of me, and it'll be just like the prophets. who are before you. He says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Now, we're supposed to rejoice and be glad in suffering. That is totally contrary to what anybody would think would be normal. That's against what the world says. We're supposed to be happy when we're suffering. That's not normal. That is the opposite of normal. It's very interesting as you look at stories throughout history. There's a really good book that I liked reading, and I read it when I was a teenager, called Jesus Freaks. It's written by DC Talk, an old Christian band, if you don't know them. It's very interesting. They wrote 2 books, Volume 1 and Volume 2 of this, and it was stories of modern-day martyrs. Martyrs that weren't just in the Bible. They kind of were after those early church fathers and later on. And what's fascinating to me is so many of those stories, the people who were being persecuted and killed and tortured for Jesus, they always were calm. They were at peace within themselves. They were at peace with the people before them. They would sing, they would pray as they were being tortured and executed and many other things. And this attitude of rejoicing and happiness in the midst of this suffering, it baffled people. And people were converted because of it. People see the weird parts of us that are really different than the way society works, and they take note of that. Many Christians did not renounce Jesus. They suffered for him. And Jesus, in fact, himself did this, and Stephen, and many others throughout Acts. And Acts, there's so many stories throughout Acts of people suffering, being persecuted, beaten, all over the place, and yet they go away rejoicing. Now, a note on this happiness, on this rejoicing, it is not the happiness or rejoicing of stoicism or masochists. They don't enjoy the pain, and they don't ignore the pain. It hurts. It's not fun. It's not pleasant. It is suffering. But they rejoice because they have a great reward in heaven. They shift their focus. They shift their focus from their pain and their suffering, and they look to Jesus and they say, I'm suffering for you and for the great reward that you've promised us. I'm running this race for you. They have a purpose, they have a goal, and they have a vision, and they know what they're suffering for. Therefore, they're happy. Not because the suffering makes them happy, but because they know they're doing it for a good cause, one that is worthy and just, and they let Christ shine through. There's just so many examples, and it's such an interesting and odd and beautiful picture, but it all flows together. And I also want to point out at the end of verse 12 that it's just like they did with the prophets before us. We're not alone in this suffering. It's happened to all of God's people, and we can't be surprised by it. Suffering and persecution for Jesus is not an if, but a when. It will happen, so don't be surprised. And if it's not happening, that's surprising, because we're promised it. We're not promised without it. And so it's odd when we don't suffer. We need to take note of that and maybe take note of our lives. Why are we not suffering for Jesus? Because it's expected that we would. It's expected that we might have a few enemies because Jesus had a lot. And we'll have enemies on account of him. We should live a righteous life, is what we see through this. One that can be seen by others with a pure heart. So through this study of the Beatitudes, we've seen a lot of different things. We've seen that we as followers must have a proper understanding of ourselves before God. We must be humble before him. We must mourn our sin and the sin of the world. This leads us to be meek, humble, and gentle. This leads us to hunger and thirst for righteousness, have a deep desire for it. Followed by us being merciful towards others because we've been shown great mercy. It leads us to have a pure heart because he's asked us to. Taking out all of the evil things and living only for him with only righteousness within us, with a heart that is pure. We then pursue peace with everyone, but not everyone will accept Jesus or righteousness or the countercultural principles that he teaches. He tells us that, in fact, we will absolutely be hated for it. And it's not a surprise. But we have a great reward in heaven, and we should rejoice and be glad because of this. We've run a long and hard race, and must continue on to the end where there is an amazing gift. You see, all of this makes a beautiful image, and really the Beatitudes wraps up what a Christian should be. Now, Jesus is going to go on to expand upon this. He's going to start giving us examples, and he's going to say a few more things. He's going to give some specific instructions to some specific Christian practices, but really, it's all going to come back to this. He's going to reference this and say, look, your heart should still be here. This is where you should be, because the Pharisees at that time did not have a heart like this. They did not have a pure heart. They didn't live like this. He said they're surface level. They look righteous. They do religious things, but they're not. This is who my follower is. That's what he says to us here. And he'll continue on, and we'll study that later on. But this, I think, beautifully wraps it up. Again, throughout this week, identify these parts in your faith walk. Rate yourself. How are you doing on these? You know, am I really struggling? Am I doing okay? Am I doing pretty good? And you know, it'll shift week to week. But seek to do these things. If you struggle over these things, seek to be held accountable with your struggle. Everybody here is a sinner. Everybody struggles with something on this list, if not every single thing on this list. We should work together on this race. We should hold together, because we're going to be hated for this. It's not easy when we're not only hated by the world around us, but we have to do these hard things that are against what we're supposed to, against our nature, against what we generally think of the way the world works. So run together. Think of these things and seek to do them. Remember, all of this is seeking to be pleasing to God, to be a delight to Him. And so he says what delights Him is when we know these things, when we know who He is, and when we do these things. So do these things. If you are in need of help in this race to pursue Jesus, His way, and being a delight to Him, or if you need to enter into covenant with Him and baptism to start the race, please reach out to someone here at Come